And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and today we're going to be looking at Freud and literature. Such an immensely fun topic. So anyway, before we do that, let me just say that if you appreciate these videos that I have made, and I've made too many of them, and you want to support me, you can check out my Patreon, or you can check out some of my books, but we'll talk about that more later. For now, let's just talk about Freud and literature. So fun. So first off, you might, if you're not familiar with this kind of stuff, you might be thinking, why would Freud and literature be connected to one another? Now, Freud actually has a lot of influence on literature, not necessarily through his own sort of idea, not his own writings, but basically people who were inspired by him a lot of the time. So, Freud, for those who are unfamiliar, is obviously the kind of seen as the beginnings of psychoanalysis, a very, very important figure in the development of psychology and psychiatry, and he basically developed the concept of talking therapy. So, what you think of when you think of sort of going to see a psychologist, you sit down and you talk to a person who then takes notes and then helps you work through whatever it is that you are currently struggling with mentally. Right, that is Freud. So, Freud also, obviously, we're going to get into a bunch of things about Freud. So, mostly, let's actually just first jump straight into it, actually. And let's first just talk about Freud himself in very, very basic terms, and how these things can be connected. So, let's first off talk about some key terms. So, the psyche is basically the mind, which is distinct also from the brain itself, but they are connected to one another. So, there is a distinction between the brain and the mind, right? The brain is the physical thing that you have in your head, right? It's made of grey matter, white matter, blood, blah, 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 all the things that your brain is made out of, right? It's the thing that does the thinking for you. The mind is essentially the mental construct that the brain produces, your thoughts and memories and all those kind of things sort of incorporate that. And the psyche is all of that together, pretty much. And so when it comes to psychology, that is what you are studying. You're studying the psyche. You're studying the mind. You're studying, that's why psychology is distinct from like neurology, the study of the brain, but they are connected to one another. You can't completely disconnect them. You can't say that the brain does not have an effect on the mind. The brain is the mind, but it is more than just the biological aspect of it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay. The next things is the important distinctions between the id, ego, and superego of Freudian ideas. So basically, the ego and the id and the ego are sort of your two axes of sorts. Sort of, you could see them as poles on each side of each other, where the id is stuff like your base instincts, your desires, your deep thing. A lot of the time, it's also things to do with sort of sexual desires and such. And the superego is more how you relate to society, and the ego mediates between them. The ego allows you to basically function, combine to connect the id to the superego, right? Because you can't just allow your deepest instinctual thoughts and what have you to come to the forefront. That would be a problem, right? Your inherent desires, your fantasies, your sexual fixations, your unbridled instinct, you can't just allow that to come forward, because you need to also think about other human beings, and the ego allows that to mediate into the additional things. And it is important to keep in mind that the id, ego, and superego are in conflict with one another. They are kind of struggling together to hold together your psyche as a whole. So when it also comes to understanding of writing, right, when it comes to how does literature relate to these sort of things, we often will look at stuff like, think about the author and how much of their id comes through into their writing, how much of the unconscious can be found there. But we're going to continue on from now. So another major concept is hysteria, which is basically a negative aspect of the psyche, that hysteria is essentially the unregulated emotions that come forward. Now, hysteria also has a lot of negative associations for very obvious reasons. Hysteria was used as basically a diagnosis for women who experienced feelings and were struggling with that in some way. The idea of someone being hysterical. So there is a lot of negative association with that term, but it is an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to Freud and sort of especially early psychiatry and psychology and what have you. Now, the next important thing is repression. Repression is a fundamental aspect of Freudian psychology. To understand repression, or to understand Freud, you need to understand repression. Repression is basically the way that your ego senses things that happened to you. It's protecting you. So it's your mind protecting you from things that have happened either in your past or just things that are in your id. So it could be memories. You're repressing certain memories, say negative memories. If you were abused or if you struggled with something, everyone experiences things like trauma in different ways. But essentially, it's a way to keep trauma in, so it doesn't affect your standard functioning, right? Because your brain, your mind wants you to be able to keep functioning, and so the ego stops those things from basically getting in the way. But they can also cause like neuroses later in life. You can start having problems because of unresolved repression and sort of unresolved traumas that you have experienced. But your mind is basically keeping it from you, which is now can cause various things. So that's why you get a lot of mental illnesses and that's an important thing to keep in mind. The word can be caused by traumas that happened, right? You can be depressed because of trauma. You can have schizophrenia because of trauma. You can have borderline personality disorder because of trauma. All of these things need to be kept in mind when it comes to understanding the psyche. But it is important to keep in mind that it is a thing that can. It's not definitive. It can be caused by it. The next important thing is therapy, the talking cure. And how language is important in psychoanalysis. So this especially we're going to go into when we talk about Lacan, which is the next video. I hate Lacan, but I'm going to talk about him next time. But basically, the means through which we express our feelings, the way in which we talk about our emotions, is mediated through language. Right? The talking cure requires language. You need to be talking about what happened to you. You need to be talking about the things you're struggling with. You need to be talking about your mental illness. You need to be basically narrating your own life, and that's because human thought is mediated through language. Thought is a difficult thing to sort of ground, and so language allows you to ground it, to understand how you're feeling and what you're thinking. And that's why it's very important to keep that in mind, especially when it comes to literature, right? Because literature is comprised of language. So language and Freud go together, language and therapy go together, so you can say the same of literature and the psyche. So through the psyche, you are able to produce things, right? When you're a writer, right? When you make things, you are mediating that through language. And so the thoughts, ideas, and what have you that you have, which are part of your mental processes, are being conveyed through writing, through language. So that is an inherent connection that you get between Freud and literature. This also, just to say, this particular video is mostly talking about like Freud on his own, because it's important to understand Freud to understand Lacan, who will be spoken about next, and his is much more connected to literature and language. So, just to keep that in mind. Okay, the next thing, the conscious versus the unconscious. So, the conscious is, right, you're conscious of things. You are actively thinking, you are deciding things, etc. And then you get the unconscious, which lies underneath it. Also, the unconscious is not the subconscious. You shouldn't confuse those two terms. The subconscious is not, to my knowledge, a Freudian concept. It's the unconscious. So if you're writing an essay, don't accidentally say subconscious. So it's the unconscious. The unconscious is things that you are not actually necessarily thinking about, but they are things that inform the way that you think, right? So think about if you have certain biases, right? Everyone has biases of different descriptions. You might have certain beliefs based on how you were raised, etc., etc. And so when you think certain things, you might not even realize that you are thinking those things through something else, right? You might not realize that you, say, for instance, have a regressive view of something. Let's just say that you were raised in a standard patriarchal society. And when we think of Western societies, well, Western societies, Asian societies, African societies, they're all very patriarchal. So when you were raised in a patriarchal society, you're more likely to have certain patriarchal ideas about women. So you might not even realize that you are having a patriarchal mindset, yet that is the thing that is informing the way that you think. So you might not, for instance, so I'll give an example from my own thing as someone who is sort of anti-patriarchal. And this is a very, very irritating thing. You get a lot of people who are trying to be more progressive. They will try to claim that they are in no way patriarchal. They're in no way sexist. The thing is, you do still have these deeply embedded ideas from how you were raised, the society you grew up in. And so even like actually being against these bad things doesn't mean that you don't experience them. It's that you choose to argue against them in your own mind. So here's an example. When I first watched, it's an anime called Full Metal Alchemist. I watched it, I enjoyed it, and then this is what I always do, I look up the authors and stuff, and it turns out it's written by a woman. And my immediate thought was, that's strange. And then my second thought, as soon as I had that thought, was, why did I just think that? Why could a woman not write this kind of story? See, that was my immediate patriarchal thought was, oh, it's like an adventure story with blah, 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 blah. Must have been written by a man. It wasn't written by a man. And so then my brain had this instant, lack of understanding, basically. It immediately struggled with understanding what I was thinking. And then my lack of immediately just accepting that made me sort of think to myself, why did I think that thing? So the unconscious thought was patriarchal. The conscious thought was going against that sort of immediate assumption. So the conscious, what you're actually thinking, the unconscious, what is underneath it, and the unconscious, according to Freud, can be found through dreams. Your dreams can show your true unconscious. Now, the thing is, I'm very wary of this kind of thing, because also Freud had a very universalist idea about dream interpretation, right? That symbols in dreams represent the same things for everyone, and I think that's nonsense. That is culturally dependent. What your culture, every culture has certain symbols, so, and also think about Freud, right? If a modern person had a dream about a smartphone, Freud's ideas of universal concepts wouldn't apply because, well, smartphones didn't exist when he was around. So if it's universal, it means isn't it always there if it's universal? So there's many reasons you can go against the idea of universal interpretation of dreams. Different cultures have different symbols that can be interpreted in different ways. I also think it's a little bit of a stretch, in my personal opinion, to say that dreams are always some unraveling of the unconscious. But that is something that is, important to keep in mind. Also when it comes to an understanding of literature through psychoanalysis, is that the conscious, right, as the person who's writing a book, they are consciously writing a book, but unconsciously, they are not necessarily thinking about all the things that they basically wrote about. So, think about a person who has patriarchal views, and so they write a book which then has a patriarchal depiction of women. Now, they might not even realize that they were being sexist, but they were, right? They consciously did not think they were being sexist, but unconsciously they wrote a character who was sexist. See, they didn't even realize what was happening. That is why, it's one of the reasons why, you can't necessarily say that the interpretation of the author is definitive. What the author thinks what their book is about is not necessarily correct, because, yes, you might think, well, I wrote it, so therefore I know exactly what it's about, except that you don't actually know yourself completely. There are parts of yourself that you don't know, and so you can't just say that the interpretation, the intention of the author is always what counts. So Freudian sort of psychoanalysis helped with concepts like the death of the author. So if you're by this level, by this level of sort of literature, you probably should know about death of the author. So death of the author influenced like that. Death of the author influenced semiotics in literature. So it's important to to realize how important all of that actually is. Now, also, of course, the impact of dreams on literature. A lot of literature has been inspired by dreams. Not all. For instance, I'm a writer, and I have actually only been inspired by one dream because I don't really dream. Well, okay, I do dream, but I don't remember my dreams, so to me it's the same as not having dreams. So I'm not inspired by dreams, and saying that writers are always inspired by their dreams, not true. They can be, not necessarily. Some people have much more vivid dreams than other people. Depends. Okay, the next thing. The conscious system and the unconscious system, right, that we just talked about, is basically mediated by the preconscious system, which is like your censorship drive, your ego, that is mediating between those two things, right? You have your unconscious thoughts, which then goes through a censorship process and then comes out as conscious. So we've kind of already spoken about this idea, right? What you immediately think in your brain, your unconscious thoughts, which inform the conscious decisions that you make, have to go through a process to reach the conscious. Okay, now the next thing is when it comes to repression and the development of a person, the way that you experience trauma in life and then the way that your mind processes that and represses what it needs to repress can alter the way that you develop as a person, right? It can stunt certain parts of your emotional development. Think about how many people, it's like a very famous and, thing that you get the concept of, like, a daddy's girl and a mommy's boy, right? That's because they had probably, you see, this is also, it's generalizing though, but a lot of the time, or at least the commonly understood assumption of this is that people who have a overbearing or negative relationship, so usually when it comes to like a daddy's girl, like a girl with daddy issues, as you'll usually talk about, because actually daddy's girl and girl with daddy issues are different, but that's usually seen as because of a lack of attention. Girl didn't get enough attention from daddy, and so now has daddy issues, whereas boy who got too much attention from mommy has mommy issues. That's how you often sort of conceptualize it, which is problematic in and of itself, but it's a way a lot of people see it. So that could be a good example of how, right, getting a certain type of experience when you're young can stunt the way that you are later in life. And yeah, that's just a fun little thing. The next thing I said here is the unconsciousness of repression. That repression is generally something unconscious. You don't sit there and actively decide, I had a trauma when I was 5 years old. I saw something that traumatized me. I'm going to choose to repress it. You don't choose to repress things. Repression is unconscious. You don't realize it happens. That's also why some people actually forget certain things, because your mind has basically blocked it from you. Your mind has said, no, that is too traumatizing for you to deal with. We're gonna just stop it. We're just gonna move on. That is a thing that can happen when it comes to that. Now, some final little concepts here are things like displacement, screen memories, and condensation, which are Freudian concepts. Displacement is where you basically take meaning from one place and displace it to another place. So usually it'll be like you've put a lot of significance on something that is insignificant because the meaning has been displaced, right? Think about how, actually from a writing perspective, I can say this, where writers are often very superstitious people. If you wrote something really good with a certain pen, you don't want to then use another pen because you've displaced the significance of your own ability to write onto this magic pen. The pen is the reason that you have written something so good. You've sort of displaced it onto something that's actually insignificant. And then screen memories are when insignificant memories or like events cover for more significant ones, right? Where you can often see where people will have weird fixations on certain events in their life that seem very trivial. And a lot of the time that's actually because it's covering for the darker stuff. So imagine, for instance, something Imagine something traumatizing happens to you, and the only thing you can really fixate on is that there was, say, a particular painting, and you'll remember this painting. But the thing is, the painting was there when you experienced the traumatic event, and you actually remember the painting more than the traumatic event, but they're tied together because it's sort of something insignificant that's tied to something significant. So it's a screen memory because it's blocking the rest of the memory, like a screen as in something that blocks something. In modern understanding, a screen is often a thing on, like, on a phone, but a screen is something that blocks something. Like a screen door is something you can, close and then people can't see through it. or things can't get through it. Okay, the next one is condensation, which is many thoughts being sort of brought together into one. It's sort of a metaphoric understanding of something, or more like metonymic, I suppose, understanding of something, where you take a lot of thoughts and you pack them all into one thing, and that's the thing that now has the meaning to you, which is just another of these sort of Freudian little concepts which aren't necessarily related to literature. But what is related to literature is symbolism. Different cultures have different symbolic understandings and representations of things that they understand, and those symbols that are important in your psyche do become embedded in literature. Things that are important in society become part of literary metaphor, right? Things don't become, part of metaphor in literature if they're not important. They are important, and that is why they become in literature. Right? It's not like the other way around. It's not like they're important in literature and that's why they're important in real life. They're important in real life, that's why they're important in literature. Okay, the last little thingy here, in terms of Freud specifically, I'm going to talk about is just the Oedipal complex in very brief terms, because it is a developmental theory about sort of human psychosexual development, where the young boy, let's just first say, who is Oedipus, for those who don't know. Oedipus is a character from Greek myth, and in this particular case, he uses Oedipus Rex by Sophocles as his primary metaphor for this. So, Oedipus, and also just to say, because this is something that I don't know, it just irritates me, Oedipus did not have the Oedipus complex, so, I think it's an incorrect name. But anyway, Oedipus was a character who was basically... his father had a prophecy that his son was going to kill him, so he tried to have his own son killed before he could be killed by his son. But the person who was supposed to kill him, just abandoned him somewhere. He grew up, outside of the confines of, the king and whatever, where, because he is a prince, but he grew up outside of that, became, a great warrior, whatever, and then he was going to the city of Thebes, I believe, to help them with the problem that they had. And on the way, he encountered someone who was basically, difficult with him, and they fought, and he killed the guy. And then he carries on, he saves Thebes from the Sphinx. He then goes there to Thebes, and they say, oh, well, the king has been missing, so you can marry the queen and be our new king. So he does that. He marries the queen, he has 2 children, and then later discovers that the man he killed on the road was actually his dad, and that the woman he married now is actually his mother, and his 2 children are born of an incestuous bond. So, interesting. Now, obviously, the reason I say this is not at all the Oedipus complex is because the Oedipal complex is basically the idea that the boy becomes fixated, like a boy who's in development, any boy is in development, and then they become fixated on their mother as part of their development, and they essentially see their father as a threat, which is seen as sort of a psychosocial threat. It's usually because the father is seen as the figure who has sexual possession of the mother, and so the boy has a desire to have sexual possession of the mother but cannot sexually possess the mother, and so it basically creates a problem that needs to be overcome for development to continue. Now, the reason I say Oedipus didn't have the Oedipal complex is because he didn't know he was marrying his mother. It was all complete chance. It was essentially dramatic irony. It was a terrible situation that happened. He wasn't struggling with an attraction to his mother. He didn't know it was his mother, but whatever. So the Oedipal complex is that. It's an important part of Freudian psychology, so it can go there, but I'm now moving on. So the last little thing I'm going to talk about, which is the application of psychoanalysis to literature and art. So, what can you actually do to apply these kinds of concepts to literature? Well, you can talk about how people who write are writing the author's psyche, right? They're writing the unconscious. They are actually writing what is inside them. So how much of what is written, right, by a person is conscious and how much of it is unconscious? Obviously, the actual physical act of writing is very conscious, but how much of the other act is unconscious? How much of the decision-making, how much of the ideas are determined by the unconscious? That is something you can interrogate when it comes to Freud through a lot of these concepts. You can talk about the id, the ego, superego, repression. How many of these things actually affect the unconscious that leads to the conscious act of writing? Or You could look at the text in relation to the author's psyche. So you could sort of try to analyze the author through what they have written, which is fundamentally a problem, obviously, because you can't just always do that, right? You can't say, this is what a book is about, and therefore the author agrees with those things. It's a very, very naive way of seeing things. Also because the existence of antagonists sort of disrupts that. If there's a character who's the hero and a character who's an antagonist, the bad guy, you can't sort of say, oh, the author agrees with what the bad guy says, but you also can't say the author agrees with what the main character says, because what if that isn't the point? What if the character is based on different political ideology than the author possesses? So it's a bit of a problem to do this, to try to analyze a person through what they have written, but it is something that you could do if you wanted to, sort of as an exercise. Or the other thing you can do is analyze fictional characters as if they were real people. Now, obviously, the fundamental problem is that characters are not people. Characters in stories are not human beings, which means that their entire existence is predicated on what has been written about them. So they don't necessarily have a deep inner life because you don't get to see that. So analyzing why a character is a certain way is fundamentally difficult because, well, you can't sit down with a character and talk about their mother. You can't talk about their childhood unless that is explicitly in the story. But if it's not explicitly in the story, then you can't focus on that. But those are three of the things you can do with Freudian psychology and literature. However, we're going to talk a lot more about sort of Freudian, well, it's not actually Freudian, it's Lacanian, or Lacanian, whatever, when we talk in the next video about Lacan and literature, which goes more into some literature and language concepts. But this is sort of a baseline understanding of how you can use psychoanalysis in literature, and understanding literature and literary analysis, and etc., etc. So that's where I'm going to be ending things off, and if you did like it, if you did appreciate it, if you did enjoy it, whatever words you want to say, and you do want to support the kind of stuff that I make, you can do so by just, checking out some of my books, or becoming a patron on Patreon, if you so desire. If you don't want to, you don't have to. If you would also like to, support me, but you don't want to do it through monetary means, or you can't do it through monetary means, you can also like, comment, subscribe, share the video, all of those usual kind of things. And so that's it. That will be the end. So I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and I hope that Freud doesn't damage you too much. Goodbye.